Let's play a game with Curious Chimpanzee, who's a longtime viewer of the stream. And let's go for it with 1e4. Yeah, as Jan said, I thought it was more than impressive. Well, we have another chance to play an Alapin. And we face d5. So I remember that previously I've played this line against Curious. So let's see if he has picked up some of the theory. Of course, here we play e takes d5, queen takes d5, and d4. We've had this particular position many, many times. Highly, highly theoretical. Black plays knight f6, which is the main move. And of course, we respond by developing our own knight f3. This is all theory. And here, black is at a major crossroads. There are 4 or so options that are all worthy of attention, and one of them is indeed knight to c6. Now, knight c6 is probably the move that you would be making if you were looking at this for the first time from black's perspective. The drawback of knight c6 is that the bishop on f8 remains locked behind the e7 pawn. And according to the new Alapin chessable course, the best way to try to punish the move knight c6 is precisely by exploiting its principal drawback, which is that when white plays dc, black is unable to recapture on c5 with the bishop. And if black has to take on c5 with the queen, then it gives white a bunch of tempi that we can use to accelerate our development. So the move here, according to the chessable course, is pawn takes pawn. Now, of course, pawn takes pawn is a move that you might be reluctant to play because it allows black to trade queens and force our king out into the center at the cost of a pawn. And you might also think that it's quite easy to win the c5 pawn back, but that couldn't be further from the truth. So I am going to play dc, even though I'm pretty rusty on the theory after queen takes d1. So if Curious is intimately acquainted with it, then, then the position's going to get sharp. a5. So a5 is a very understandable move. He's preventing us from playing b4. But that doesn't mean that we have to part ways with the c5 pawn automatically. In fact, we have many, many ways that we can try to cling to that pawn. We don't want to cling to it at the cost of ruining our position. We want to find some sort of middle ground. And if we're giving that pawn away, then we want to find a good reason to give it away. So what are the options for defending this pawn straight away? Well, one of them is to play bishop to e3, but as you know from many openings, the drawback of bishop e3 is that it runs into this very annoying move, knight to g4. Why is knight g4 annoying? Because knight g4 threatens to eliminate the bishop from the board, to ruin our pawn structure. And then once black pushes e6, we once again have the problem of that pawn. So the move h3 comes to mind as a candidate move in order to meet e6 with bishop e3. Unfortunately, black can fly through a different airport. Black can play knight to d5, and it's essentially the same effect, where this bishop is destabilized. So I actually don't think that we should go for that approach. Now, a3, e6, b4 fails tactically, because black will play a, b, c, b, and knight takes b4. You should know this from, the Queen's Gambit and other openings where you get this pawn, this type of pawn that you're trying to defend. So I actually think we should take a more indirect approach. One of the drawbacks of the move a5 is that it weakens the b5 square. So you might say, okay, well, then let's play bishop b5. But bishop b5 has limited value because black can just play e6. What I like is a very Alapin-esque type approach to this position that involves trying to get the knight to b5. And that seems very promising to me because from b5, the knight will not only be aiming at c7, but in the event that black pushes the e-pawn, which is very likely, and let's play the move knight a3 as I'm talking about it, once black plays e6 or e5, and we respond with knight to b5, we can also stick the knight onto d6. And what could happen then is a situation where black takes on d6, and we take back, securing the bishop pair and getting control of the dark squares. And even if in the subsequent complications, black wins that pawn on d6 back, I still think that we're going to get the upper hand in the resulting endgame. So knight a3 is a move that should be on your radar if you're experienced in the Alapin. I mean, we've had plenty of games where I made this move in the middle game, and it makes sometimes more sense to people when there's a black queen on d5, because then you can more clearly see the effect of the move knight to b5. But even without the queen, knight to c7 is still very much a threat. So knight a3 is a nice flexible move. It's a developing move. And we're kind of waiting for black to put his cards on the table. All right. So it's a good sign that Curious is starting to think. Well, if black had played the immediate e6, then of course we would have played b4. And that, I think, is one of the theoretical lines. I'll open up the chessable course after the game to check in on what the actual main line is according to the authors. Knight to d5. Okay. So a very understandable move. Black is trying to cover the c7 square. But just like the bishop on e3 is quite unstable, so is the knight on d5. Now, some of you might instinctively want to play c4 or bishop to c4, both of which are reasonable moves. I like bishop c4 more because it's a developing move. But the problem with bishop c4 is that black can respond with e6 and defend the knight and open up an attack on c5. And in that subsequent position, we actually could trade on d5 and play the move bishop e3, and then we've basically permanently secured our extra pawn on c5. So that's one option. One option is absolutely to play bishop c4 here and chase the knight away. Of course, another option is to stick to our guns and play knight b5. And this one I like even more, because knight b5 creates a very devious threat of c4, as well as bishop c4. And once this knight is dislodged, white's knight travels to c7. And it may seem like a case of one move-itis, like, oh, is this really such a serious threat? Well, it actually is a very serious threat. Because in order to defend against it, black has to make one of several major concessions. Black basically has to ruin either his king safety by moving the king to the d-file, or his ability to castle queenside by moving the rook. In either case, black basically has to waste a very valuable move just to defend against the threat of knight c7. King d8, okay. And now that we have induced this particular move, our knight on b5 is also just chilling. We could also go at it from the other side with knight to g5. And that's a more common idea than you might think, sticking the knights on b5 and g5, hitting the f7 and c7 squares. So knight g5 is a very interesting approach. Black will probably respond with knight e5 in order to defend f7. And if we play f4 there, ooh, then black could try to counterattack our knight with h6. I'll show that line after the game. So that's one way we could play. We could also play this more straightforwardly, just developing the bishop with tempo, bishop c4. Looks like a great move as well. I like bishop c4. I think it's simple and very strong. Solidifies our advantage. Knight g5 is the move that you would play if you wanted to win the game on the spot. So knight g5, knight e5, c4, b4. I'm trying to calculate that line out. It's a little bit hard to assess how good that is for white, in contrast to just the simpler bishop c4. Knight g5. Very, very tempting move. Let's go for it. Let's go knight g5. I'm going for the throat this game. Sorry, Curious. I'm going for the throat. Just intuitively, this feels like it has to be the right move. Just intuitively, it feels like knight g5 squeezes the most out of the position. And it's not such a big commitment. Right? You shouldn't think of a move like this like a path of no return. Okay, it doesn't work out, big deal. We're not introducing any permanent weaknesses into our position. We're just creating a threat. And knights, unlike pawns, do move backwards. Okay, and bishop e6 immediately justifies our move. Immediately. Because now we have the standing option of taking on e6. And to say that it ruins black's pawn structure is basically to say nothing. It just permanently destroys any semblance of normalcy that black has within the pawn structure. So I'm taking those doubled e-pawns any day of the week, particularly Wednesday, which it right now is at the time of recording. Now, if you're a pedant, then you might say, well, I don't have to take on e6 immediately. I can just sort of chill in this position because the bishop's not going anywhere. But that doesn't mean you always have to do that. Right? Just because you don't have to rush a move doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't play it if you can avoid playing. And I don't see a reason for us to keep this knight on g5. It's not doing all that much. And we might save a tempo on a different move, but I think we should play it simple and just take on e6 while we have the chance. So now we have a choice of different squares for this bishop. And it's pretty self-evident to me that our next step involves bringing this bishop out. Now, the pawn on e6 is now one of black's main weaknesses, and we can attack it in several different ways. We can attack it from a rook that would come to e1, but I think I see an even more effective way of really targeting this pawn and solving several problems at once, which is a relatively unconventional form of development, which is why I think some people might struggle to visualize this idea. It might not occur naturally to you, and yet I think it's quite strong. Now, yeah, to get the bishop onto like either the h3 or g4 square. So there's two ways to do it. You can play bishop e2, bishop g4, which is excellent, or you could play g3, bishop h3, which I call the hyper fianchetto, because you're moving the bishop in that direction, but you're not fianchettoing it. Both options are totally viable, but I like the look of g3 just because it's a little bit more elegant. Yeah, let's go g3. What about c4 to fork? Well, remember that the c7 square is already protected by black's king, so we no longer are aiming for the fork on c7. Okay, well, now we follow up with our plan, bishop h3. By the way, if you really look at deep positional play, you sometimes see people, especially strong GMs, play h4 in these types of situations in order to optimize the kingside pawn structure and to potentially be able to use that pawn as a battering ram later in the game. Here, we have bigger fish to fry, and we have an opportunity to really go after black in the center before he's completed his development. So it's much more important to play concretely than it is to make these, beautifying positional moves. Now, the move e5 has a very obvious drawback, which is that the knight on d5 has now lost its support, and the idea... I use this phrase very sparingly, but it essentially plays itself. We want to put a rook on d1. We don't want to attack this knight in any random way, right? If you play bishop e6, the knight can easily drop back, let's say, to c7. And what have we achieved? So instead, we need to move this king out of d1. We can move it to the c file. We could move it to the e file. It really doesn't matter all that much. I like keeping the king closer to the center in the endgame. Also, you should notice the role that our pawns are playing in restricting the mobility, heavily restricting the mobility of both of black's knights. In particular, the d4 square is covered. The b4 and f4 squares are also covered, which was one of the major appeals of playing g3 as opposed to bishop e2, bishop g4. Now we have a devastating threat of rook d1, and I think black might be borderline dead lost here. And it's not just because we have an extra pawn, it's because black's position is completely in shambles. And rook to d1, I don't think black has a good answer to it. He can't castle, right? The king has already moved. I think the king e8, rook d1. Black can try to defend the knight with rook d8, but we can still play rook takes d5 there. Rook takes d5, and it's a classic trick with knight coming to c7 and picking up the rook again. No, it's lost. I mean, black is totally dead here. And that's how quickly this endgame can go bad for black when you start making these concessions. Yeah, king e8, rook d1, and then the knight can't move because of knight c7. Yeah, e6 might be the only move. E6 might be the only move here in order to gain a little bit of breathing room for black's pieces. Of course, in the event of e6, we will take on e6, and essentially black can resign there as well. What's the issue with knight f6? Well, then we give a check on d1. The king is forced to slide over to e8. Remember, that's partially why we put the bishop on h3. It wasn't just to attack e6. It was so that when black played e5, we're also containing the king and preventing it from moving to c8. So knight f6, rook d1, king e8, knight c7, and the game is over. When did he become so lost? Well, first of all, this endgame is better for white. I'm pretty confident that according to modern theory, this is not the best choice for black. That's why you don't see a lot of top GMs going for the two knights variation with knight f6, knight e6. Okay, kudos to Chimp for finding e6. Obviously, we don't need to spend any extra time here. We can just grab this pawn. It's a very low-risk move. So these types of moves can be made very quickly. Now, the knight now has a big problem, because if it drops back to c7, then we deliver a check on d1. We force the king away, and we win the knight. And then there's checkmate to follow with the other bishop coming out to g5. If black drops back the other way, knight f6 is probably the only way to keep the game going, would be my guess. I think knight f6 is the only way to stave off immediate defeat. And then we'll think. I mean, maybe bishop g5, maybe rook d1 check. Lots of candidate moves there that all should win the game. Knight c7 played. Yeah, well, this is just going to lose. Rook d1 check. King e7. And we collect the knight and simultaneously deliver checkmate on g5. GG. GG. Obviously a short game, but an instructive one nonetheless from a theoretical standpoint, because it shows you how dangerous this endgame is for black. Even though white's king to begin the endgame is less safe, it's very hard for black to win this pawn back on c5. So I'll show you a couple of important theoretical lines. Definitely a line that you can play with black if you're very well versed in the theory. Okay, so e4, c5, c3, d5, ed, queen d5, knight d4, knight f6. So in terms of popularity, in the position after knight f3, in terms of popularity at like the over-the-board level, bishop g4 and e6 outweigh knight c6 in popularity. Bishop g4 is by far the most popular move. Here, there's bishop e2 and knight b to d2. There's even pawn takes c5 here, which has become very popular recently. So even here, pawn takes pawn is a move. And what's funny is that in this position, black plays e5, and historically this has been considered a bad line for white. But recently, some GMs have breathed new life into the position, because in this position, it turns out that white can still play b4. And this is a trick that you should be very familiar with. This does not lose a piece for white, because white can counterattack the bishop and basically drive it out of its pinning position, which occurs in many, many different openings. Bishop h5, you play g4. Now, the funny thing is, in order to garner the maximum amount of pawns, black very often plays knight takes g4 in these types of positions. But it turns out that white is the one who gains a big initiative. So here the line goes hg, bishop takes g4. And what is the best way to solve the problem of the knight? Well, basically, you want to avoid allowing bishop takes f3, because that forks the king and the rook. So the move here is knight b to d2. You're essentially forcing black to recapture on f3 with a pawn, which puts an end to black's initiative on the king side, and then it's white's turn to seize the initiative by completing our development quickly. And you can do that in several different ways. I think knight to c4 is considered to be a really good move here. And black is just really badly developed. Technically, both sides only have one piece developed, but white's development proceeds more naturally, and it's quite easy to win this f3 pawn back. It's an unorthodox structure. It's a hard position to understand. After knight c6, the best move is bishop h3. And the point is that after the trade, we're going to win the f3 pawn back. And we're going to have this massive, massive pawn phalanx on the queen side that can often decide the game, because a well-timed b5 can send this knight away, and then you could quickly push c6 and create a passer. So black is also having a lot of difficulties finding sort of suitable employment for the bishop. Now, so this line has suddenly become very popular. So bishop g4 is one option, e6 is another option, and here our move is knight a3. I think we've already had a game in the speedrun with this line. And again, same idea as we carried out in the game. After cd4, the point is we play knight to b5. And we threaten the fork on c7, gaining a tempo. And black typically plays queen back to d8 or knight out to a6 to protect c7. And then I think white has a modest but stable advantage. If black plays queen to d8, then we can play queen takes d4 and go for a slightly better endgame, or we can take back with a knight, and white just has slightly more pleasant development here. There's nothing major to say about the position like this. There's a lot of theory here, lots of GM games, but this position is quite approachable. It's easy to play even if you don't have like encyclopedic knowledge of the position. The main move is actually knight b takes d4, but the engine move and the way to get the biggest advantage after queen to d8 is in fact queen takes d4. And then if black plays queen takes d4, it's already plus minus. This endgame is incredibly nasty for black for much the same reason that the endgame we had in the game was nasty. Black has no good way to defend the c7 square, because the move knight a6, as tempting as it is, it basically freezes black's situation on the queen side. Black now has no clear way to deploy the knight. Black has to keep an eye on the c7 square. The bishop on c8 is locked out behind his pawns. So this should be it should be visually apparent to you that this is a pretty bad endgame. For example, let's say bishop f4, black plays bishop d7, and white just continues developing. No need to do anything drastic here. Just play bishop e2. There are 2 games in the database. Both of them continued knight d5. And in both of them, white got impatient and basically cashed his chips in for the bishop pair and played knight d6 check. Of course, this keeps a big advantage, but the engine just likes keeping the tension with bishop g3. The engine just likes keeping the tension with bishop g3. It's +2. So let's say bishop e7, black develops, right? Hopefully I'm making reasonable moves so far. Castles queenside, continuing the development. Let's say black castles kingside. Funny line, if black castles queenside, he gets checkmated on a7, which is a worthy mating construction to be aware of. But if black castles kingside, we make the simple improving move bishop f3. Then we bring the rook to e1. And again, you might be surprised that it's +2. That's a pretty drastic evaluation. But it really is that good. Just compare the placement of the pieces and you will see that black's position is not only miserable, but very hard to play because black is running out of useful moves. This rook can't move because a7 hangs. The other rook can move to d8, and now our rook moves into e1, and bishop takes d5 is a threat. And we could also reposition the king on a safer square on b1. So just very, very unpleasant, annoying endgame for black. That's why knight a6 is the choice of more top GMs here. But it doesn't fully solve black's problems. I won a recent game here over the board. You play knight b takes d4. So in this situation, you don't recapture with the queen. You recapture with the knight. And again, it's not easy to play. Bishop e7, most popular move. And you just develop your pieces. Bishop e2. You just develop your pieces. Castles, castles. And as usual, if black ever plays e5, white's response is always going to be the same. If black ever plays e5, your knight goes back to b5. And again, you get this situation where the knight on a6 is essentially out of commission. And now the pawn on e5 is another additional weakness that black has to be saddled with. Now, hopefully this is making sense. Just a little bit of an overview of the main lines. Now let's get to the move that happened in the game, knight to c6. So d takes e5 is far from the only move, although it is the engine's choice at a very high depth. So let's get straight to that move. Now, it should be pointed out that queen takes c5 does not solve black's problems. As I pointed out, this gives white rapid development. And here the best move is actually not bishop e3, even though I said it during the game. I forgot. The best move yet again, is to play the immediate knight a3, heading straight for b5. Black can lose this really, really quickly if he's not careful. So a couple of illustrative lines. Let's say black plays e6. Then our knight jumps into b5. And already black is in big trouble. Because if black plays knight to d5, then white wins on the spot with the move c4. Same concept as in the game because we're threatening the knight on d5. And if black counterattacks, remember that you're also hitting the other knight. So here you win on the spot. So black has to make a super awkward move and kind of contort himself in order to defend the c7 square, upon which we can play queen a4 and bring the queen out, and black can't go here because of the fork. So constantly black is stumbling on his own feet here because of how cramped the position is. And after a6, bishop f4, the game is over because we have too many threats, knight c7 and knight d6. So this is a already very nasty position. If black plays a6 in order to protect the b5 square, this is a very common situation. b5 is protected, but now c4 is incredibly weak. So now we can go bishop e3. Let's say the queen swings over to h5. Now we can play knight c4. And our knight is heading for b6. Again, this is very, very juicy. So no matter how you slice it, and you can look at this on your own a little bit more, there is also the move e5 here, which is a little bit more ambitious than e6. It happens pretty often. we play knight b5. A lot of GM games here. Queen e7. This is one of the main lines. And here, according to the engine, white is slightly better, but more importantly, the position's very easy to play. You play bishop e3, and if black plays a6, your response here is always going to be the same. Queen to a4. Very important resource that pins the pawn to the rook. And you might say, well, why is that dangerous? Black can just move the rook. Well, if black moves the rook, you actually castle queenside. And this is the line I show to anybody who says the Alapin is a boring opening. You sack the knight on b5 in order to get rapid development and a huge attack. Bishop takes b5, bishop d7, defending the knight. And of course, you make a very calm move. Very important. Just because you've sacrificed a piece doesn't mean that every subsequent move has to be a sacrifice or has to be something forcing. You just bring your other rook into the game, and that extra piece is the difference between success and failure in the attack. Black is paralyzed. Black has no moves. Let's say that black tries to bring his bishop out with g6. Well, now it's time for more tactics. Knight takes e5. Bang. Knight takes e5, and now bishop g5, creating another pin. Creating another pin. And your pieces are all just, I mean, you're just going to massacre black here in the center. And then after bishop g7, you have two pins. This is one, and this is the other. So both of black's knights are pinned, which means you have rook takes d7 winning the game. Really, really pretty line. Really, really pretty line. Knight takes d7, and bishop takes d7 check. And then and only then do you recapture the queen. So it's a cool line, and it gives you a sense of how promising this can be. And that's why I think queen takes d1, king takes d1 is really the only viable continuation for black from a practical standpoint. And here we get into some very theoretical waters. I don't want to bog you down with too much exposition of the theory because you can study it yourself. And, you know, I know that a lot of newer players are watching me, so it's probably boring as it is. I'll just give you a sense of what the main lines are and why black experiences problems. So on chessbase, the main move is e5, and it's closely followed by bishop g4. I actually think a5 is not a bad move. It's been played, but it does, you know, it gives white a very hefty advantage. And my response, by the way, knight a3 is not best. Apparently, after a5, the best move is, in fact, to play the simple bishop b5. And then to meet bishop d7, just sort of standard play. The engine actually likes... okay. There's a detail that I missed. According to the engine, you go rook e1, e6, bishop e3, and knight d5, it turns out, is not very scary because you can just park the bishop on d4. So this is an important detail. You can put the bishop on d4, and if black ever takes it, then of course you can rectify your pawn structure by taking back with a c pawn. And now you're just up a full pawn. So, yeah. But I still think after knight a3, it's all about the practical difficulty of playing a position like this. I think black's position becomes very difficult to play just because you have so many holes, and you have to be ultra precise in order to keep everything secure. So instead, the two most popular moves are e5 and bishop g4. In response to e5, white, of course, plays b4. And this is already very, very unpleasant. If black plays e4, then you can always swing the knight into the square that is now open, the d4 square. So the most popular move here after b4 is bishop f5. But bishop f5, okay, it's not particularly dangerous. You can just play bishop e3, which is the best move. And if black castles queenside, then your king slides over to c1, which is a very safe square, and it's already plus minus. We're following a Grandmaster game here. Berilovich against Moisenko from 2007. And the best move here is just to bring the other bishop out to b5. You are not afraid of allowing knight takes e3 because you're a pawn up. And again, black is experiencing major problems with finding a suitable developing square for the bishop. There's also a Gawain Jones game here, titled Arena on Lichess. Wow, so white actually played a lot of theory here in a bullet game. f6 is what happened, and now white can improve the placement of our king with king b2. Then you can play knight bd2, rook d1. Again, black has no compensation for the pawn. And remember that anytime black tries to cut into the pawn chain, you can always just play a3. Once black's rook leaves a8, you can just meet a5 with a3. So that's one line. The other move that occurs very often is bishop to g4. This would probably be my choice if I knew nothing about the position. Here, you take the opportunity to bring your bishop out to e3. Now the main move is knight c5, as we discussed during the game. And the engine move is bishop c4. This is kind of sort of an engine-y line that is worth just memorizing, because it turns out that after knight takes c3, f takes c3, white's play hinges on a very important subtlety, which is that after e5, you do not play b4 in this position. The reason b4 is bad is because after e4, h3, we had a very similar position where white's bishop was still on f1. What's the chief difference? Well, the chief difference is that now black can play f takes g2, and this is very, very unpleasant. This gives black additional tempi that he can use. Black is better here. Instead, what you do here is you play the immediate h3. You sacrifice the c5 pawn back. Now it looks like black takes it and black is completely fine, but appearances are misleading. I analyzed this position, and white is significantly better here. This can be a little bit hard to explain. It's about plus over minus. It's 0.7 in this position. And I would say there's 3 reasons that white is better in this position. The first is white's control over light squares is more meaningful than black's control over dark squares. Notice that a lot of the critical important squares in the center are all light squares, whereas black's bishop is sort of biting on granite on e3. And white's king is a very reliable defender. Yeah, e3 is technically a weakness, but black cannot reinforce the pressure on that pawn. Reason number 2 is that white's pawn majority is more mobile than black's pawn majority. Comparing pawn majorities is a very good way of understanding the position at a deeper level. White is a 3-on-2. Black is a 4-on-3. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that white's pawns are already ready to rumble forward. b4, a4, a5. And if black plays a5, then he creates a gaping weakness on b5. On the other hand, black's pawn majority doesn't roll forward very easily. Black can play f5. But black can't create a passed pawn very easily, and black's pawn movements aren't very meaningful. The third reason is that white's knight has better prospects than its counterpart. Notice that black's knight on c6 is completely restricted by these 2 pawns highlighted in yellow. They're controlling all of the knight's potential advancing squares. White's knight has many different paths that it can take. In particular, it has very easy access to the e4 square, and later on in the game could potentially access the outpost on d5. So that is, in sort of verbally, why white is better. Now, how is the game likely to unfold? Well, if black plays f5, then the engine move here actually is immediately to start pushing the pawns forward with a4. Black plays, let's say, rook d8, for example, right? Just making neutral moves. And b4, you just start grabbing space and pushing black's bishop away and pieces away. And now a5. A lot of people, newer players, would be tempted to go b5. Who can tell me why this is a bad move? And if you're watching on YouTube and you're sort of newer to chess and you're a little bit lost, this is a good opportunity to review some of the positional basics. Why is b5 bad, but a5 is good? Yeah, it's because of knight a5. And what's happened is that you have allowed black to establish a complete blockade on the dark squares. And because you don't have a dark squared bishop, your pawns are now fully paralyzed. So don't get blockaded like that. Push the other pawn first. Now you're trying to go a6 in order to soften up black's knight on c6. Now, I hope my explanations earlier were somewhat understandable. And this is a type of position that occurred in one of the Nepo Ding games, where black is now saddled with permanent weaknesses of his pawns. And white's knight potentially has access to c5. And black can't castle because white's controlling the light squares. So, you know, it's good not to be dismissive and just say, oh, this is too much for me to understand. I'm too new to chess. You can understand how such positions operate, and that is exactly how you learn about positional chess, how you learn about maneuvering play and where pieces belong. It's by analyzing endgames like this one. But the bottom line here is that you do sometimes sacrifice the c5 pawn back in order to gain certain positional assets. In this case, to reclaim the bishop pair and to gain control over the light squares. By the way, if after h3, black refuses to take the knight, the move here, just a moment, what is the move here? Oh, it's just g4, bishop g6, And actually, you go king e2, so you still give the pawn back, and then you go after black's bishop with knight h4. And then you bring the other knight out, and again, your control over the light squares, as well as the prospect of pushing your queenside pawns, gives white an advantage here, despite appearances. By appearance, this should be equal, but because of these weak squares, white is actually better here. So very instructive positional ideas here on top of the sort of specifics of the variation. Last thing I would say is that you should not be afraid of getting your kingside pawn structure ruined, because here you also get the bishop pair. And black has no easy path to reclaiming the c5 pawn, because you can always reinforce it with b4. And so I would say that black is in a lot of practical trouble in this endgame. Of course, if black plays knight e4, trying to fork these two pawns, you have bishop e3. And this is why this line works concretely. You have this bishop e3 move to support both pawns at once. So in any case, a5 knight a3 is not the most precise move. And the reason, apparently, well, white is still better. Apparently, bishop g4 chimp is the best move here. Just quickly prioritizing development rather than trying to sort of artificially defend the c7 square. The problem with your move is that the knight is very unstable here. That's like the bottom line problem with knight d5. The knight is very easy to kick out. I would argue that after knight b5, black is already completely lost, unfortunately. Just because you're suffering on all these squares. Okay. Yeah, so knight d5, knight b5 are in big trouble. You have to get your pieces out, because that's the only way to compensate for the loss of a pawn. And the thing is, at this point, I would not play knight b5, because this would run right into castle's queenside, and now the knight looks kind of useless. So after bishop g4, I probably would have played bishop e3, or something of that nature. And if black castles, I would have just shifted the king around, let's say to e1. And the game continues. Black has some activity here. I think white is clearly better. Insufficient compensation, but you can continue playing. So something like this is what I would do with black. I would play bishop g4. If black plays e5, then white's idea works like a charm. Here you play knight b5. And obviously, black has no easy way to defend against knight c7. This is the main idea. So knight d5, knight b5, king d8, I think is, I'm not going to say forced, but I don't see any other reasonable move here. And now I attack you from the other side, knight g5. I think that your only chance to stay in the game would have been to play knight e5. I'm curious if you consider this move, because after bishop e6 happens, I think the weaknesses of your center is just too much. It's +6 after knight e6. So knight e5, only move to stay in the game. Of course, white has f4. And now you have h6. So this is one way to not give up f7 with a fork. But of course, white is still winning. And the simplest approach for white here is just to grab the second pawn. And things are made even worse for black by the fact that e6 is now completely impossible, because the knight will always hop into d6. Maybe rook h5 can be tried here. But white can reinforce the bishop with h4. Another annoying detail. And f6 we can develop with tempo like this. So just not good for black. But perhaps the game could have continued a little bit longer. After you play bishop e6 and I play g3, the game is over. You just have too many weaknesses. This is coming out. Black is paralyzed. You're not getting your bishop out. You tried your best here. g6 was good. e5, I mean, you played reasonably, but the avalanche is just falling on black here, and you've got no coordination, no development. So the biggest mistake, the chief culprit, of course, going into the endgame was one thing, but this knight d5 move, right? When you're a pawn down in a situation and you've got a lot of weaknesses, generally prioritizing your development, prioritizing active development is the only way forward. If you try to kind of bandage up your weaknesses and put band-aids over all the weak squares, something's going to give, because you just don't have enough firepower to keep your pieces where they belong, if that makes sense. And this is exactly what happened here. You just start collapsing because you just don't have the activity to keep your knight firmly entrenched on d5. I'm threatening c4. I'm threatening this. You've got problems on the d file. And so that's what tends to happen when you try to play a little bit too passively from a defensive side when you're in this type of situation. So a nice Alapin game. Thank you, Jim, for playing. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the game. A shorter one, but I still hope you found the opening exposition to be relatively instructive. Again, the point is so that you're able to watch these speedrun videos and actually play the opening yourself. So this kind of doubles as an opening tutorial, even though we don't cover all that much in the grand scheme of things in every game. But still, I mean, hopefully you get a sense of what people actually tend to play. And so on that note, I'm going to call it a night because I want to get my 7 hours in before Arena Kings tomorrow, which I will be streaming in Russian. Thank you, everybody. Lovely Blitz session today once again. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.